last lecture, we talked about the rival churches that developed out of the Donatist controversy. How in the aftermath of the persecution, of the Great Persecution, when some bishops had handed over books or been accused of handing over books, there developed in Africa two rival churches with different sets of bishops and different ecclesiastical structures. Not just the Bishop of Carthage, but many cities have two bishops. I want to talk now about how they went about claiming or making the claim that they were the legitimate church of Africa. And this has to do with the martyrs. As with the last lecture, I'm just going to begin with a few pictures to show you, in this case, Tebessa, another one of the cities that was impacted by the Donatist controversy. If you go to Tebessa, there's an enormous basilica complex at Tebessa. In this picture, I'm standing back at one end. This entire area here seems to be, maybe from what we can tell, the place that pilgrims would literally stand in line. There's a system here. It's like going to the airport when they put up the railings to make you go here or there. There's a system out here where the pilgrims would line up to get into the church. And you can see the steps of the church. In the interior of the church here, you can get a sense of the scale, how large this basilica was. Christianity was very important in Africa. Extensive populations would have gone to these enormous churches. Here's a capital from the church with the cross on it. And then here's a picture of the baptistry. And these column parts that are fallen into the baptistry would have stood around the outside and would have supported a roof. And we talk about Augustine, I'll show you the baptistry that Augustine used at his church where a part of the roof is actually preserved. Basically, these large churches like this in parts of Africa, no one really goes there anymore. This is in Algeria. No one really goes to these churches, to these archaeological sites. The main people who use these places are actually teenagers who are going somewhere to smoke or drink, because no one ever goes to these Christian basilicas. So there's one place you can go and hide to drink. Here's a place to go. So when I was on the Algeria tour, it was not uncommon that the security guards went in first, and then we would see teenagers in different parts of the archaeological site scrambling up the walls and jumping over the fences and getting out. And we'd come in, and in the bottom of this baptistry, we actually found a lot of beer cans. So we removed the beer cans before I took the picture. But in the modern world, Christian churches is a place that you go to drink, at least in some places. I guess in some churches it's that way too, but this is the experience. So these are places that are, again, were schismatics rebaptized here or not? Okay, so we saw this chart last time talking about Caecilian, who is elected in 311, how the charge is made that Caecilian had been ordained by a traditor, by a lapsed bishop, and therefore he couldn't be legitimate. But he had the support of Rome and the support of the emperor. And that Majorinus was elected by his rivals, by Caecilian's rivals, replaced by Donatus, and he seems to have the majority of the North African support. And we finished with this slide talking about the use of the term Catholic, how both sides want to use the term Catholic to say we are the true church, we are part of the universal church, we are part of the international church, we are the true Christians in Africa. So in response to the claims by Caecilian to be Catholic, what I'll call here the Donatist Catholics, this is a term you will probably never see anywhere else in your life or in any of the literature, but I'm using it just to tell us about the situation, give us a sense of what it's like at this time. The Donatist Catholics claimed they were in common with the martyrs. So Caecilian, on his side, said, I had the support of Rome. I had the support of the emperor. Well, how do the Donatists respond? One of the ways they respond is to say, well, we have the martyrs. We have the martyrs. And in particular, the apostles, the apostolic martyrs come into play here. Not just the martyrs of North Africa, but the martyrs of the early church, especially Peter and Paul. How do you prove that you are the legitimate church? We're the legitimate church because we're the church of the martyrs. Not just the martyrs now, but the martyrs of centuries past, including the apostles. And I've written a chapter in one of my books on particularly Paul and the way that Paul is honored as a martyr in North Africa and the way that Paul functions in this debate. How both sides are trying to say, Paul is part of our tradition. We are in the tradition of Paul. Both sides are making that claim against each other to try to show how they are the legitimate church. So if we go back to our chart, the chart's getting a little bit crowded now. Where do the apostles and martyrs fit in? Are the apostles and martyrs, do they come into this line? Do they feed into this area with Caecilian? Or do they feed into the Donatist line? If you go back in time, who has the apostles and the apostolic martyrs in their lineage? Because the Catholic Church, whichever church is part of the universal church, whichever church is part of the universal, official, proper church, the Orthodox Church, that church can claim they're in the line of the apostles. But which church is it? Which side is it? Both sides are going to claim that they are. And we see this in several ways. Now, in this case, we have to say that the evidence that survives for us is skewed. It's heavily in favor of Caecilian, because Caecilian was recognized by Rome, by the emperor. We have a lot more sources that survive from that side. We don't have that many literary sources from the Donatists, from Donatist authors, but we do have some. So some of the readings we'll be doing in this course come from Maureen Tilley's translation of some of the Donatist martyr stories. And one of those Donatist martyr stories that you're going to read is the Acts of the Abytinian martyrs. This is a story written in the midst of the Donatist controversy, but it's set back before the controversy started. It's set before Caecilian is elected bishop. Actually, it's set in the time when Caecilian is a deacon. So it's a text written after he's the bishop and after this fight is happening, and the story is set about 10 years earlier. So basically it's saying, let's look at the past. In this story, Caecilian shows up. So Caecilian, the bishop whom the Donatists have rejected, shows up. And he shows up in a very particular way. There's a scene in which, let me pause and say this. In the ancient world, if you were in prison, the government didn't provide anything for you. If your family and friends didn't bring you food or water, you didn't get food or water. It's not like the modern prison systems in most parts of the world where I think in my country it costs more to keep a prisoner alive than it costs to keep me alive in my country. In the ancient world, that's not how it was. In the Acts of the Abytinian martyrs, there's a dramatic scene where some Christians have been arrested. They're confessors. They've stood up for their faith, and they're in prison. And some other Christians are bringing them food and water. But they're prevented from bringing them food and water. Who stops them? Who stops these pious Christian women from bringing food and water to the confessors? Is it the Roman guards? No. It's Caecilian. Caecilian, acting on behalf of the bishop, stops the women from bringing food and drink to the confessors. What does this mean? Who's the Church of the Martyrs? Well, Caecilian, your bishop, the person you say is your bishop, we know that he actually hates the martyrs because he actively prevented help from getting to the confessors. Now, is this story true? We have no other sources about this, and this may be a total fabrication. And even if it is a fabrication, this is the kind of rhetoric that's being used. When you read the Acts of the Abytinian martyrs, with all these texts, we need to read them carefully. They all have a perspective. They all have a story to tell. And this story says Caecilian is against the confessors. Caecilian is against the martyrs. Therefore, his church cannot be the Church of the Martyrs. Therefore, our church is the Church of the Martyrs. Therefore, our church is the legitimate church. So the martyrs here play a critical role. If you have the martyrs, you're legitimate. Now, on the other side of the debate, we have a lot more information. We have multiple authors on the other side of the debate. Is there a question?
The fact it may be fabrication, that story, but it must then have been a credible fabrication. So why was it credible that Sicilian was against the confessors?
Yeah, so the question is, even if this story is a fabrication, it must have been credible. So how would it have been credible? Well, some scholars look at this story and they say, well, why, especially scholars who are favorable toward Caecilian, because they maybe are favorable toward the Catholic tradition, they see him as being the legitimate bishop. Well, maybe the situation was that the bishop of Carthage at that time knew that these women who were seemingly bringing food and water, they were really going to cause a revolt. Or they were going to cause a demonstration. They were going to make a scene. And so maybe the reason Caecilian prevented them from coming to the prison is he didn't want there to be a scene. The bishop said, try to keep all the dangerous element, try to keep them out of the way. So the kind of the Catholic rereading of this text is, well, yes, Caecilian is doing what he has to do to protect the people overall. Think about the Gospels. When some of the leaders say, it's better that one man dies on behalf of the nation than that we all are killed by the Romans. It's a similar kind of idea. So there's that possibility. The other possibility is if people believe that Caecilian had been ordained by a traditor, if they believed he was illegitimate, they might believe just about any terrible story you would tell about him. I don't know how politics are where you are, but in my country, our current president is very popular with some, very unpopular with others. Our past president was very unpopular with some, very popular with others. Unpopular presidents, people can say almost anything they want about them, and people who hate that president are going to believe it. So perhaps some of it is people just hated Caecilian. So you tell a story like this, and they might say, oh, that sounds like him. That sounds like something he would do. So they're writing these texts for a reason. Apparently this works. Right? Apparently it is a credible fabrication. Apparently it's working to undermine his authority. In the same way that Lactantius said what he said about Licinius, Constantine's rival, because apparently it worked. Or at least they're hoping it worked. On the other side, we have a lot more literature. And there are multiple authors who write against the Donatists. And you're going to be reading some of these. You'll be reading from Optatus, the bishop of a city called Milev, or Milevis, who writes against the Donatists. And Augustine. Augustine is another author who writes against the Donatists. So if we go back to our chart that's getting a little crowded here, where does Augustine fit in this chart? Well, because Carthage is the most important city of North Africa, the bishop of Carthage ordained the other bishops in the cities in the region. And Hippo, where Augustine is eventually the bishop, is another city in the region. So the bishop of Hippo was always ordained by the bishop of Carthage. Well, which side is Augustine on? If you trace it back, Augustine was ordained by someone who, back up the line, was ordained by Caecilian. So Augustine is on this side. Augustine sees himself as a Catholic, as a member of the international church, in support of this tradition. Now, by the time of Augustine, Caecilian is long dead, and Donatus is long dead, but the rival hierarchies are very much alive. So Augustine's on this side, and he writes, in many cases, specifically against these Donatists. So I'll give you another image to look at here. This is a picture of Augustine's church in Hippo. Hippo is another major city, probably the other largest major city along the north coast of this part of North Africa. So this is in modern Algeria. In the city, I think it's Annaba is the modern name. And so here we're looking across the length of the basilica, and here's the apse, the front of the basilica here. And this is in Annaba in Algeria, the north coast of Algeria. Ancient Hippo. Hippo Regius is the official name. This is the city where Augustine was bishop. This is his actual church. This is another shot coming from an angle. And this is the church coming along here. This is the more modern church of St. Augustine, which, as you might imagine, in Algeria, no one ever goes to. Very few tourists ever go there. No one really goes to church there. But you have the more modern, kind of Baroque church of Augustine up here, the ancient church. Here is the baptistry that Augustine would have used to... This is Algeria, yes. And here is Dr. Mike Glarup. Some of you may know him from the class. This is Mike setting up his tripod to take some great picture that is probably actually in the atlas of early Christianity that some of you may have seen. So the image you see in that atlas, if they're from a lot of these cities, they were from a trip that Mike and I were on a few years ago. Here's Mike in action, looking good as always. So in the apse of the church, in the front of the church, is the seat, the bishop's seat. And we know from accounts of Augustine that he seems to have sat down when he gave his homily, when he preached. He didn't stand up and shake his fist like maybe we imagine someone like Jonathan Edwards to do. So I couldn't resist sitting in the bishop's seat, and here I am making this symbol, which you may see in icons of Christ. And people often say, oh, Jesus is saying peace. Well, no, he's not saying peace in those icons, and I'm not saying peace here either. This is Christian theology in 5 fingers. So you have 2 fingers in the air to represent the 2 natures of Christ, the human and the divine, and the 3 fingers touching represent the Trinity. So if you go to a museum and you see a statue, you see a painting of Christ or of a bishop, you'll often see Augustine doing this. I call this the early Christian gang symbol. This is the 2 natures of Christ and the 3 persons of the Trinity. So I sat here, and then I happened to have with me an excerpt from one of Augustine's sermons, so I sat there and I read it out in great voice, and I had someone filming me, and it was a great moment. For me, probably not a great moment for Augustine, but a good moment for me. Now, how much was Augustine impacted by the Donatists? We're going to see in a second how he talked about them, but in one of his sermons, he says that when our church is quiet, they could hear the Donatists singing. How close was the Donatist church to Augustine's church? They could hear them singing. It's pretty close. It's pretty close. So, Augustine takes on the legitimacy of the Donatists, and he says, the martyrs, the question of the martyrs. So in his work on obedience, he has this passage. It's a longer passage, but it's worth looking at. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his just ones. It's a citation from Scripture. Therefore the death of Peter is precious. Therefore the death of Paul is precious, the apostles. Therefore the death of Vincent is precious. Vincent, a martyr from Spain. Therefore the death of Cyprian is precious. You have to mention the great African martyr. On what account are they precious? Because of a pure affection and a good conscience and a faith that is not false. That snake, however, sees this. That ancient serpent, this is the devil, sees that the martyrs are honored and the temples are deserted. So Satan looks and he sees that in Africa, the pagan temples are being deserted because the Christians are going to honor the martyrs. So how does Satan respond? He carefully concocted cunning and poisonous plots against us Christians. And because he was not able to wield influence over Christians by false gods, he created false martyrs. But oh, you Catholic sprouts, compare with us a little those false martyrs with the true martyrs, and by pious faith discern that the devil is trying to cause confusion by a poisonous fraud. Satan could not lead people astray by getting them to follow the pagan gods and goddesses. So Satan raised up the Donatists with their false martyrs to lead people astray. Don't be led astray by them, he says. You Catholic sprouts, you poor little saplings, you little plants that are in connection with the universal church, don't be led astray by Satan. Satan has created false martyrs. Those Donatist martyrs, they're false. Don't follow them. In another sermon, in honor of the annual festival of Peter and Paul, Augustine says this: "Today, brothers, we honor the memory of those who have sown the seed, through whom God exhibited what he promised to them and what he's promised to us through them." What did he promise them? "There remains for me the crown of justice, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will present on that day." And here he quotes Paul, 2 Timothy. What will the heretics, that is the Donatists, read aloud against these things? I think that even they celebrate the festival of the apostles. They indeed strive to celebrate their day, but they do not dare to sing this song. The song of Paul, the song that says, "The crown is waiting for me." The Donatists may claim to honor the apostles, but they can't claim that. They can't claim that the crown of righteousness is waiting for them. God has nothing waiting for these Donatists. They can try to worship the apostles, but they don't really do so, because they aren't real Christians, because they don't follow the true martyrs. In 411, the Council of Carthage officially condemns the Donatists. But the story doesn't end there. The story does not end there. The following year, 412, the emperor, the Western Emperor Honorius, renews the official suppression of the Donatists that Constantine had done earlier. The imperial suppression of the Donatists that Constantine did for 5 years is back now under the Emperor Honorius. So now again you have a group of people who consider themselves legitimate Christians in the tradition of the martyrs, in the tradition of the church, being oppressed by an emperor. So Honorius goes into the line with, in the minds of the Donatists, Nero and Decius and Diocletian and Galerius and Constantine. Both sides seem to have existed until at least the Muslim conquest. I say at least because in a few lectures we're going to talk about this question of the end of African Christianity, which many people say when the Muslims arrived it was all over. We're going to see that the evidence doesn't suggest that. The evidence does not suggest that Christianity just ended when the Muslims arrived. But evidence of the Donatist controversy does dry up. And it's possible, any number of things are possible. When the Vandals arrive, we'll talk about the Vandal invasion of North Africa. It's possible that during the Vandal invasion, maybe these two groups began to try to work together because both sides agreed that the Vandals were heretics. So maybe they came back together in that context. In the previous lecture, there was a question, when does this end? It's very hard to say exactly when it ends. The Council of Carthage in 411 officially ends it from a church law perspective, but practically speaking, it doesn't end there. And as we all know, church law and practicality aren't always the same thing. But certainly after the Muslim conquest, we don't have any more evidence of this. And even leading up to that period, the period of the Vandals and such, the evidence begins to dry up. So this debate really burns the hottest in the 4th and 5th centuries, beginning in 311 through the 5th century, and then our evidence begins to dry up a little bit. So here we see how the martyrs function in claiming who's the rightful church. You have two different hierarchies. Can you imagine how confusing this is? As far as we can tell, everything else was the same. They seem to have the same doctrines. They seem to have the same worship. And a Christian says, which church do I, if a Christian moves to a new city, how do you know which church to go to? One passing literary reference suggests that possibly the Donatists whitewashed the insides of their churches to distinguish themselves, but it's very difficult to say anything specific based on that reference. It's a passing reference at best. So as far as we can tell, maybe no one even knew the difference between these different groups, at least from the outside. Questions about the Donatists and this Donatist controversy. Obviously, we could do an entire course on just the Donatist controversy. There's a lot here, but in the time that we have, we're hitting some of the highlights, or lowlights, I guess, depending on your perspective. Yes?
The Donatists view the Catholic as being descended from unworthy bishop?
Do the Donatists see the Catholics as descending from an unworthy bishop? So let me go back to this chart here. In the minds of the Donatists, everything is fine until 311. Everything's fine until 311. So if you say so the Bishop of Carthage right before Caecilian, no problem. So Felix he's not the Bishop of Carthage before Caecilian. He's the one who ordained him originally as a priest. So the Donatists would say until 311 everything was fine. But they would say in 311 a group split off. So in their minds the tradition is here. It's here, and in 311 this group splits off, this schismatic group splits off, and they're continuing in the direct line.
So, okay, I understand the position of the Donatists.
Yes.
Okay? So what about the position of the Catholics? Why do they reject Donatism?
So why do the Catholics reject Donatism? Because in their minds they have a bishop. This is the legitimate bishop. So any group that goes and says we're going to elect a rival bishop, this group is therefore schismatic. This group has left. If you have another bishop who's claiming to be, this is the Catholic bishop, this is the bishop who represents the Catholic Church, this is being in the church. If you have another group that's claiming a different bishop, they are outside the church. Yes?
Do we have any other sources about Donatism from other churches like Alexandria, Antioch, or just it's all about Carthage?
Yeah, so do we have examples of a Donatist controversy in other places like Alexandria or Antioch? We don't seem to have anything like this. The dynamics in Alexandria are different, and there's nothing that corresponds to the Donatist controversy. There does seem to be an African issue. And we have to be careful, but I think some of the elements are the generally more rigorous approach that we see in the African churches. And another element to this, to go back to our second lecture, is Rome. Rome is part of this discussion. And we can, I guess, speculate, but the fact that Rome sides with Caecilian, I don't think that makes most Africans feel any better. Because they already think that the Roman Church is too soft on the lapsed. They're too soft on rebaptism. And they already know that the Roman bishop really wants to tell them what to do, and they don't want the Roman bishop to do that. So in some ways, the attempt by Rome to be involved here may have made the problem even worse. And in a place like Alexandria, maybe no one's going to think to ask the bishop in Rome anyway. Yes?
We prove that the Donatists were more rigorous in other areas also in matters of morality.
So is there any proof that the Donatists are more rigorous in other areas as far as morality goes? Not that we can see. So if you ask the average person in a Donatist church or a Caecilianist or Catholic church, what do you think about the lapsed? Most of them probably thought the same thing about that. Most of them probably had the same perspective on just about everything. We don't have any indication that, for example, Caecilian and churches in his tradition, they were more liberal overall. We don't have that, because Augustine's in this tradition. So we can't tell any practical difference of this. It seems to be a structural difference.
Not really lineage.
It seems to be a question primarily of lineage, yes, and of the bishop, right? Who's legitimate? But we don't have, well, I will say this, the Catholic side does begin to say lots of things about the Donatists. So there's a charge that there's a group, this fringe group called the Circumcellions. It's an infamous group, and there are charges that some of these Donatists get violent, and that there's this kind of fringe group out in the country that riots and causes problems, and that we don't know. That may or may not be true. One of the charges against the Circumcellions is that they're these ultra-radical Donatists, although in the minds of the Catholics, they're just like any other Donatist, who are so upset that they can't be martyred that they jump off cliffs and say, I'm a martyr, or I guess, I'm a martyr, as they go down. So they're so radical that they jump off a cliff and claim to be a martyr. And from the Catholic side, from the Caecilianist side, that's how these people are. They're radical. So, but were they actually jumping off cliffs? We can't say for sure, but this is some of the rhetoric that is used.
So we can tell
it appears that both sides have the ideas of Cyprian about the lapsed, yes. And the question here is, I mean, if Felix did not hand over books, if Felix is not a traditor, then Caecilian is perfectly, he's legitimate. I'm sorry?
If he is not a traditor, it will be all made up.
If he's not a traditor, if this story is made up about him, then Caecilian was properly elected the bishop. But people don't like him because they don't like his policies, particularly on the lapsed and lapsed bishops. So this is probably why many of the North Africans don't like him. So, but were there people who were rigorous on the lapsed who were also in his church? Probably. Yeah, I wish we had a lot more information about the rank and file, but what we have, as far as the people in the pew, so to speak, a lot of that comes from sermons, and most of those survive from Augustine.